a day that would pretend continuity. Inside, the scriptorium held a wound and a plan. Matthias' hand closed on the ledger and would not release it. He would not be able to say how much courage or how much guilt had driven him. The line between the two was already too faint. He only knew this: a marginal stroke could change a liturgy, and a single forged leaf would not be sufficient to choke the names into silence. But first, they would have to live through the morning. He could not know then whether the act he intended would save lives or ruin them. He only knew the ledger was no longer paper in a hidden pocket. It was a story that needed telling. The calendar moved inexorably toward the sanctification of the chronicle. Dawn would bring ceremony and speeches and the chancellor's practiced face. Matthias walked toward the inner room with the ledger at his heart and the heavy, trembling certainty that he had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. When he drew the cloth from the official copy and laid his tiny appendix beside it, his hand did not falter. He had watched the world that night as if he were a reader watching the margins of a book. Now he would write in the margin. Outside the scriptorium, the city took a breath and decided to keep living. Inside, a page would be altered, and the chronicle would be, at the very least, a little less complete. The hook of consequence unsheathed itself like a blade. Morning promised proclamation. Matthias' small, deliberate deed promised rupture. Rain began to patter thinly against the rooftop, as if the sky itself had turned a page. The bell that would call the city to its ceremonies had not yet rung a final time. Matthias pressed the ink to the page and waited for the moment when the first words would appear and make the margin a site of memory. He did not know if the names would be believed, if Jasper's plant would feed the chancellor's argument, or if Thomas would be returned safe. He only knew the pen felt heavy and necessary in his hand. He dipped it, and the darkness of the ink opened like a small truth. At the scriptorium door, footsteps approached. Someone was coming back to see what the night had taken, or to take what the night had left. Matthias' breath steadied on the syllable of the first name he wrote, and the world held, precarious, on the seam of that line. Then the footsteps ceased, and a voice he did not expect spoke the name that would turn morning into trial. The bell had not yet tolled. The chronicle would not yet be read. But what was written in that backlit hour would demand to be reckoned with, and the city would be forced to choose between its myth and a ledger that would no longer be content to remain quiet. The words dried on the page. Outside, someone shouted. Inside, Matthias paused with the pen poised above the margin, and for the first time the ledger in his pocket felt like a thing no ink could fully hold. He wrote the name. The scriptorium at night was a thing of small light and great hush, a cathedral of paper where the past was straightened like linen and folded into neat, doctrinal shapes. Matthias had known the room for years, the smell of vellum and damp glue, the way the beams kept their shadows, even while the city around them seemed to blur into the soft tumult of the rebuilding. He had spent hours here converting chaos into narrative, turning the rashness of rebellion into the tidy syllogisms that sustained a throne. Tonight the task was inverted. He was about to make the smallest possible violence against the order he served. A single candle burned on his desk, guttering and smoking where the wick had been trimmed too close. The chronicle lay open before him, its leathern spine bowed by the hands that had read and rewritten it for decades. The official script flowed across its pages in measured lines. Matthias had spent weeks learning how to let silence sit in the margins, how to let a name slip away like a pebble under the tongue of history. Now he would make a mark the scriptorium had not authorized, a marginal appendix, a brittle list of names, and a precise reference to a ledger that should not have been. He had rehearsed the small ritual in his mind until it felt like a prayer. First, the inscription, names written in his old, compact hand, no flourishes, no rhetorical excess. He had resolved that the appendix would not editorialize. It would not accuse with trite banners or pleas. It would be a stitch of fact, names, dates, a ledger reference, a line or two to anchor the record. Anything more would invite the Chancellor's knives. Anything less would leave the dead nameless in the way they had been nameless for decades. He wanted a truth that could not easily be carved away by rhetoric. Edda moved around him with the surety of a woman who had been taught how to hide things where the eye expected to find them. She carried a narrow box of papers wrapped in oilcloth and set it down without sound. Her dark hair was bound tightly, a small coil that left her face severe and lean in the candlelight. She looked at him briefly. There was a humorless nod that carried the weight of shared risk. "You know what they'll all call this if they find it," she said, voice low and clipped. He made a small motion with his hand, an unsteadying little thing. It could be the beginning of assent, of refusal, of something else entirely. "They will call it dangerous," he answered, and the sentence had the thinness of a reed. They worked as conspirators work, methodically, as if technique could buy them time. Sister Anwen sat at the long table nearby, her veil shadowing her face. Her hands were steadier than either of theirs, and she measured the ink, ground by careful turning of a pestle, with gentleness that felt like a kind of benediction. There was soot on the edge of her sleeve. The candle had drawn a ring of dark on her apron. The candles cast the scriptorium in a pale, capacious amber. The shadows in the rafters seemed to listen. Occasionally a rat made its small, human noise in the walls. Beyond the stone, the city slept hollow with its own small worries. The Chronicle's official copy waited for them like a sleeping thing. In their plan it would not be defaced, but extended an appendix would be placed in the margin, a small, official-looking slip that read like an intrusion of fact rather than an oration. Matthias dipped his pen and began. He wrote the names slowly, as if naming them aloud would make them more solid. He kept his letters compact, no capitals that might draw attention, no flourishes that could be catalogued as the hand of a particular clerk. When a word did not sit right, he blotted it out with a small, furtive motion. The blotter took the ink like snow swallowing a footprint. Edda watched over his shoulder and recited alternate forms and orthography in a low murmur, ensuring the entries would not be sooner dismissed as clumsy. Between names he wrote nothing but the air. The list itself took shape like a line of bones. There were 23 names in all, some common as peasants' names, others carrying the odd weight of a commander's title half remembered. He knew what each one implied: a body in a ditch, the silence of a widow, a child's orphaning. He felt them like small hot coals beneath his heart. When he had finished, he paused and stared at the margin until the words seemed to blur into the grain of the parchment. Then he wrote the ledger reference, a small official notation: see ledger XI, full, for a truth couched in the paperwork that made it harder to deny. The notation was precise, the kind the scriptorium used when they wanted an auditor to follow a thread and find a fact. It was an invitation, perhaps the only one that would matter. "We need copies," Sister Anwen said softly, as if she feared louder speech would draw the whole world into the room. Her voice was the voice of someone who had spent years praying in libraries. There is a cadence to secrecy as to litany. They made copies the old way, by hand, by light, by the slow fidelity of a practiced eye. Edda copied a version with marginal flourishes in the convent's older hand, the kind that could fool a casual state examiner into thinking it was an old, forgotten appendage. Sister Anwen wrote a paleographic note in faded Latin, something to anchor the document's antiquity. The two copies would not match the official hand exactly, but they would carry the kind of corroboration that mattered in a world where authenticity was both art and alchemy. They heated the wax together like conspirators smoothing a counterfeit marriage ring. The beeswax smelled warm and sweet and dangerous. Sister Anwen pressed the seal hard, and when she set it on the cloth-wrapped slip, the wax gave a small, affirmative sound. The prints they chose were not raw scriptorium marks, those could be traced, but gilded impressions, old ecclesiastical devices Edda could render convincingly. They were not perfection. They were living proof enough for those who knew how to read beneath the surface. "You do this," Edda said, "and there will come a night when the Chancellor will ask whose hand put the names to the margin. They will trace the ink back to this room. They will look for a clerk who wrote in the way you write." Matthias' mouth was a thin line. "We will make sure it is not traceable to my household," he said. But the words were an incantation against the fear that had already caught hold of his throat. He thought of his mother folding clothes, of his sister sweeping the hearth. He thought of the way neighbors looked at them now with a caution that had the same texture as pity. They did not have time for greater stratagems. The chronicle would be sanctified within 2 days. The official copy must be both altered and unassailable on the surface. Matthias, who had spent so long eliding names, now took them into his hand as if he were carrying them to a grave. The insertion was tiny. He trimmed a slip to the edge of the chronicle's page and pasted the appendix so that it overlapped the margin but could lie flat when the book was closed. It was an act of neatness rather than vandalism. It gave their truth a thin chance of breeding in the official place. It was Edda who suggested the smaller plan: make a few authenticated slips and seed them where the city would remember not loud in the square, which the Chancellor could crush, but small networks of memory, a convent, a market ledger, a man who could not be entirely controlled by palace censors. Matthias wrote the extra slips himself, each one in the same careful hand. He carried the finished slips to Sister Arnwin, who wrapped them in the smallest pieces of oilcloth and sealed them with wax. Edda wrote a faint filigree in the corner of one, the kind that might pass as a printer's flourish to a hurried clerk. Another she folded into a market account, the kind that would be handled by merchants who did not trust the palace. "They keep books," she said when she handed it to Mira later. "They will look where profit hides truth." Mira took her piece with the casual insolence of her trade. There are things a market woman sees every day and lets slide. And such a slip could be one of them. She tucked it beneath a stack of bread receipts as if she were hiding nothing, moved through the stalls with her basket on her arm. Matthias watched from the corner of an alley as she pushed into the press of merchants. His chest felt like a bell that had been struck. To put a name under a loaf of bread was to make truth something ordinary and persistent. It would be carried, folded, passed, eventually read. Captain Ryan accepted his wrapped slip in the courtyard beneath a sky sore and grey with dawn. He did not ask for dramatics. He took a paper like a man taking a relic. When he opened it, he did not flinch. His hand broad, calloused, trembled just a fraction. He traced a name as if touching a scar. "They are here," he murmured. It was not a statement for the room so much as a confirmation for himself. Tears pricked in the corner of his eyes, small, traitorous drops on a soldier's face. For a man who had learned to measure grief in the time it took for a banner to fall, they were a scandalous fault. "Keep it," Matthias said. "Find someone to keep it safe. If there is to be any action, it is to make sure the names survive first." Ryan nodded once, his jaw setting. It was as if a clock inside him had begun to tick. "Names do not forgive," he said, harsh. "Names remember." The act of distribution was not a triumph. It was a scattering that felt like prayer. Edda and Sister Arnwin had other hands to trust, a novice who could carry a copy to a remote chapel, a merchant who owed Edda a favor, a market lady who had once given Edda a scrap of bread when she had starved. They folded the truth into the apparatus of the city and hoped the city would hold it. When it was done, the scriptorium felt impossibly large and oddly light. The chronicle lay where it had been, the marginal appendix now curved with the book's spine. Matthias closed the cover slowly, tracing the seam with the pad of his thumb as if he could feel the names through the leather. "Will this change anything?" he asked finally. Edda smiled without warmth. "It will change whether people can say they never knew," she said. "That is the smallest mercy." Sister Anwen put her hand on his shoulder, a motion of counsel and benediction. We have given them names. We have made a place for mourning. He wanted to believe them. He wanted to feel some absolution in the act. But the act had cost him in ways that were already unfurling. A cousin's shop had been observed leaving the scriptorium that afternoon. A neighbor had asked blunt questions at supper. It was a small thing, perhaps nothing to the wider city. But to a family with a history of bargaining for life, it was a beginning of a smell they had been taught to watch for salt metal, the hint of vinegar that preludes purging. He walked home in the cold, his cloak pulled tight. The city was waking. Carts rolled creakily through stone, and somewhere a bell tolled the hour. He imagined the appendix tucked into a market receipt, and then anybody reading a name and saying it out loud. He imagined the sound of that simple syllable rolling through a tavern, and then ricocheting into a chapel. He imagined the chancellor's hand finding the margin and tearing it, and the scriptorium staff being called in the dawn for questioning. At home his mother met him at the door with a worry that had the texture of hunger. It made her hands quick and restless. She asked where he had been, and he lied. She always smelled faintly of starch and stew. Tonight the scent made him feel older. He ate mechanically, fingers committing to muscle movements more than to any pleasure. His sister sat across, her eyes bright with that small domestic contentment that had seemed impossible in the rebuilding days, but had come for them by degrees. He thought he would confess, would wake them to the weight he had taken on. But the words lodged in him and would not be summoned. To admit what he had done would be to open them to the very thing he hoped to protect, the scrutiny, the retribution. A life made small and narrow by the chancellor's need to make exemplars of anyone who dared unthread the weave. He let them sleep that night in the precarious certainty that he would keep them safe and alone. When he returned to the scriptorium the next morning, there were signs that the city had already felt his small, secret disturbance. A messenger had left a note for Galen. There were rumors in the air, thin as smoke, an arrest of a sullen bookseller in the market, a patrol that had searched a confectioner for seditious leaflets. The Chronicle's sanctification was 2 days away now, the city's rituals of legitimacy hitched nearer like a drawn bow. He could feel the tightening. Edda found him at the long table, her face less composed than it had been the night before. "They have searched the market," she said without preamble. "They found nothing of consequence. They found a slip of paper that a merchant swore he had not written. They burned it. They asked if any scribe had been missing. They asked if any clerk had been up late." Matthias heard the hunger in her voice, not for vengeance, but for the rawness of truth. "They will come for the scriptorium first," he said. It was the least he could tell the woman who had risked as much as he had. "Then we buy time," she replied. "We let the Chronicle go with its appendix and rely on the confusion they will create. The Chancellor will be quick with his words, a forgerous attempt at slander, and the first instincts will be to crush. But he will also be frightened of acknowledging the ledger publicly. He will want a scapegoat and a spectacle. We must ensure the names pass into places that count, into convent rooms, into merchant ledgers, into a few pockets of memory. Then even if they burn the book, they cannot burn the minds that have already touched the names. They had no illusions that network would save everyone. There would be arrests. There might be blood. Matthias' act had not meant to make a revolution. It had meant to make it harder, from then on, to claim ignorance. He imagined a widow reading a name and weeping for a son she had taught to whistle. He imagined a child in a lane repeating a syllable and thus training memory to hold a small, necessary truth. Captain Ryan left the scriptorium at noon with his copy folded close to his chest. He did not ask for company. Before he left, however, he turned and spoke to Matthias in a way that was no longer all enmity and not wholly alliance either. "If they come for you, you do not plead ignorance," he said. "If they seek to make examples, be the one that tells a different story. Stand where the names stand. If they force you to choose between your household and what you have done, remember what you have already chosen. Matthias thought of his mother's thin face, of his sister's hands as she smoothed the hem of a dress. He thought of the ledger's names and how quiet they had been when he first saw them, how they had climbed into his chest like splinters and would not let him sleep. He swallowed and nodded. If I can slow them with facts, I will, he answered. It was the most he could promise. Ryan's mouth tightened. Names, remember, he said again, as if engraving the words. He left before Matthias could answer more. The chronicle went to sanctification 2 days later. Matthias watched from the scriptorium doorway while lanterns were fixed along the procession routes. The Empress' retinue practiced their smiles, and the Chancellor walked through a world he meant to own with his hands curled around the fabric of history. The Chronicle's official copy was borne with ritual reverence, its leather straps polished and its emblem gleaming. The appendix was hidden at first glance. An honest man might never have seen it. Yet it was not hidden from everyone. A market woman unfolded a receipt and read a name while weighing cheese. A novice in a chapel found a wrapped slip in the fold of a hymn book and read a list in the dim morning light. A lieutenant on patrol palmed a paper he'd found in a latrine and tucked it into his breast. The names began to wander like seeds upon the wind. In the scriptorium, silence thickened as an animal that had been hunted. The candle stubs burned lower. The city held its breath. For Matthias there was no triumph in the small successes. Only the heavy knowledge that he had opened an artery in the city's memory and let blood moral and human be visible. He imagined Varen's discovery as a man examining a map and finding a small, unauthorized line drawn on it. He imagined the Chancellor's face when the line was found, and the invention of a narrative to swallow the leak. What troubled him more than the Chancellor's likely denunciation was the possibility the appendix would be dismissed as forgery. After the chaos of the previous night, Jasper's planted leaf. The torn and scattered sheets, it would be all too easy to label anything that undermined the official story as counterfeit. He understood the cunning of that dismissal. Had sat in the rooms where ink was turned into law. In his bed that night he could not sleep for more than an hour at a stretch. He dreamed of names swimming in a black river. He woke with the sense that something had tugged at his sleeve, something unseen and patient. He dressed in the dark and went to the window. The city was a scatter of lights, and somewhere beyond the walls he could hear the hollow sound of a drum being practiced for the sanctification. He thought of the names again and of how fragile a thing a truth might be when it was small and unadorned. He had not expected gratitude. He had not expected a clean ending. He had expected a small, stubborn continuity someplace where the dead could be seen, if not avenged. He thought of Sister Anwen's hand on his shoulder, of Edda's tone, hard as flint and twice as merciful. He thought of Ryan's quiet acceptance, and the impression it made, like a coin stamped with some private image. Outside, the city began to change its face under the Chancellor's watchful eye, as if someone had gone in with a quiet brush and smoothed the cracks on a painting. But paint could not reattack what the brush had lifted off the canvas. Matthias had set a corner of the tapestry free. Whether it would fray or be stitched back in some new and truthful pattern, he did not yet know. He accepted that the cost was his household's safety and his own public comfort. He had thought he balanced scales when he slipped names into margins. Perhaps he had merely shifted the weight. The ledger's small explosive truth was now a living thing in the city's veins. It might make the city worse, and it might make it better in ways that would not be measured by any chronicle for a generation. As dawn edged into a sharper grey and the sanctification bells began their slow, ceremonial rounds, Matthias stood at the scriptorium doorway and watched the world set itself in motion. He had written the names. He had given them a place. Now the city would read them, or not. Now men like Varen would decide whether to burn what he had done, or to let the truth disturb the fabric of their authority. He felt, with a clarity that had not been available to him when he first found the ledger, that there would be no tidy ending. The act had not been a resolution but a beginning. He tucked his hands into the sleeves of his coat and stepped out into the morning, carrying the small, private knowledge that he had made a choice. The chronicle went down the street to sanctification with a secret stitched into its margin. Whether the seam would hold, or be cut open by hands that would make more wrongs than right, remained to be seen. At the threshold he paused, listening as if the city might answer him. A cart trundled past. A child laughed in the distance. A bell struck the hour in a tone that was neither mocking nor consoling. For the first time since the ledger had come into his hands, the guilt that had been a bar across his chest felt like a lever. He had pulled it. It moved the world just a fraction. That fraction might save a name. He walked toward the procession and away from the scriptorium in equal measure, and behind him the chronicle lay closed, its margin changed and the ink of truth drying slowly into the grain of its page. The city, unaware, continued its ceremonies of legitimacy. The names perched now in pockets of memory, traded like faint contraband, and like smoke they would find cracks in which to rest. Matthias' last sense, before the procession swallowed the street, was the impression of a small, stubborn thing that even in an empire built on ash, an echo could be given a place to exist. He did not know whether he had saved anyone. He only knew he had named them. Matthias watched the city break and be remade piece by trembling piece. It was, he thought, as if the capital had been struck with a stone whose ricochet cracked windows, not of glass but of certainty. He had expected a single clean sound, a ripple of revelation that would either wash away the stain or be drowned by the river of official disbelief. Instead, the effect was 1,000 small noises, a woman sobbing behind a stall, a child asked to step back by a father who had longer known how to hold fear in his hands, a group of men who laughed bitterly and spat the word forgery like a challenge. The chronicle's page had been turned, but the world it described had not been properly prepared for the turning. He had not been at the square that morning. He had remained, as he always returned to remain, at the margin of things, leaning over a curtained desk, palms dark with ink. The parchment between his fingers, still smelling faintly of smoke and damp clay from the convent's secret room. He had thought long hours before the insertion of the marginal appendix that his act would be private in its ritualness, a scribe's hand committing names to the text, an acknowledgement in an institutional voice that the ledger had existed. He had thought of it as tipping a stone into a pond. He had not imagined the pond's surface shattering, each fragment showing not reflection but faces. Word had traveled the city by routes Matthias had once considered trivial and now perceived as decisive. Thomas had been stopped twice, frisked once. 2 copies of the appendix had been lost between courtyard and cart. But gossip, as Mira had reminded him with a rueful wag of her chin, required no clean channels. A sheet had been unfolded on an oak stall for a coinless reading. A neighbor had read a name and had called to a mother across an alley, and a mother then had stopped in her washing and stood with wet hands while the name was spoken. The movement began there, a murmur like the stirring of a cloth that had been used to clean away soot, revealing the whiteness beneath. By mid-morning the square was a tangle of sound. Some names were recognized and spoken aloud. Some produced no recognition, but provoked a haunted curiosity who had been taken from a street whose stones now supported new shops and new signboards. Where Mara's women had once stood with folded arms and fierce mouths, now children stood between them and a line of palace watchmen who had been called out as much by rumor as by orders. The watchman's breath steamed in the cool air. Men in plain coat and thin badge were already moving, gloved hands opening their leather pouches to produce edicts. Sedition, their leaders said. Defamation, fabrication, It was Lord Chancellor Varron who compressed the imprecision of this morning into a formal line of logic. He stood on the palace steps beneath the chronicle's deep embroidery and delivered